Hey guys, back again with you today. Got another firearm out of the collection to share with you. This one is a Norinco SKS Type 56, made in China. The SKS is actually a Russian design, as with many of the Chinese guns made out of Norinco. It's just a copy, essentially. But it was designed in 1943. This particular gun was made in China between 1965 and 1980. At least that's what I'm guessing. It has a short barrel lug, which could possibly mean it's a mid-production SKS from around that time frame. There's no real good way to date these Norinco SKSs, unfortunately. If it's a factory 26, I believe, there is an estimated way, or it's not, I guess it's more of a theory. I don't know if it's really been proven, but there is supposedly a way to tell your year of production on a factory 26. I actually have a factory 306, and the factory sign is right here on the receiver generally. So that process does not work, unfortunately. As I mentioned, there is the factory symbol there. It says factory 306, and we can probably take a closer look at that later on. There is also 3 Chinese letters between the factory 306 and the serial number there. Those 3 Chinese letters translate to roughly Type 56 carbine, I guess. And this particular weapon does have the original cleaning stock in the rear of the, or cleaning kit in the rear of the stock. And I'll try to pop that out when we disassemble the gun and show you that. When you go out and buy these weapons, they are a great investment tool. That is one of the reasons I purchased this gun, was more or less an investment. 10 years ago, you were able to purchase these guns for around $80. Today, on average, you're looking at about a $300 gun here, depending on condition and depending that all the numbers match. You can get them as low as $250 and as high as $400. I think you're paying a little too much if you're paying $400, but there are rarer models out there, such as the Paratrooper SKS, which can fetch a little bit more money. But those are pretty rare and far and few between. The other common SKS that you'll find out there is the Yugoslavian SKS, and that actually has the grenade launcher attachment on the front of it. That's another really cool variation. Generally, between the Norinco and the Yugoslavian, the price variation really isn't much, so you should be able to pick them up for right around the same price. One thing I would say about this gun is, if you are in the market of purchasing one, make sure all the numbers match. There are definitely plenty of these rifles out there at those types of prices where you're supposed to be able to find one with numbers that match. If you can't find one with numbers that match on a particular gun, just wait on it. So it's definitely not worth it. When you're looking at these guns, if you're looking to buy one, where you would want to look for some of those numbers would ultimately first be the receiver, which will tell you your full number, which should match the rest of the gun. The second area you want to look is on the rear of the stock here. Make sure you have an original stock. They usually drop off the first 2 letters or numbers of the serial number on the rest of the gun, so all you're going to have there is 08280. So look at the stock, make sure that's original. You'll have one on the bolt itself, and the top of the bolt, so it's pretty easy to see it. It's stamped right in there on the top of the bolt by the charging handle. You'll also find one on the bottom of the gun on the magazine well, stamped on the bottom of the magazine well there. I'm not sure if you're able to see that right there. And you also find one on the trigger guard here, and those should match as well. You'll also find one on the back of the dust cover here, and it's going to be difficult to see, but maybe when I disassemble the gun I can show you that, but just right in the back of the dust cover, it's stamped right into the back there. And you'll also find one on the bolt carrier, which you're not going to be able to see here at this point until we disassemble it, and the firing pin assembly. I've also found that there's a couple electro-penciled numbers on some of these SKSs, one being on the gas piston, and then one also being on the extractor claw of the bolt assembly. So, if they have them, great. If they don't, they don't. I guess, like I said, they're electro-penciled, so I don't know if they're really on every one of those guns. Not going to go really into the history of this gun. There is plenty of information out there on the internet if you really want to dig into the history on this particular rifle. Again, I mainly bought it as an investment tool. I don't really want to become a historian or an expert on these type weapons. The breakdown of them is extremely easy, so you don't have to be an expert or a gunsmith to break these particular weapons down. They're very reliable, very durable, great shooters. Ultimately, if you're looking for a good shooter, this is a great rifle to go to. You can't go wrong. It's very similar to the AK-47 platform, so it's very reliable. and ultimately a great rifle. The only thing that they are prone to known for is slam fires, and the reason for that is because most of these SKSs, at least the later ones, the real earlier ones that were made in Russia didn't have this issue, but the newer ones have a free-floating firing pin. And if any kind of buildup or residue gets inside the firing pin channel, that can actually lock your firing pin in the forward position with the firing pin protruding out the front of the bolt face. And what that will do is when you have multiple rounds in your magazine, one ejects, the bolt will come forward with the new round chambering the next round. Unfortunately, that firing pin will be protruding from the bolt face, and it's going to fire off that round. So what they have is a situation called slam fire, where it essentially turns this rifle into a fully automatic rifle unintentionally. And it will fire until it releases all of those magazines, or if the firing pin becomes unblocked. When I purchased this rifle, it was actually almost to that point. You should be able to take the bolt carrier and wiggle it back and forth and see that or hear that firing pin wiggling back and forth, and that it shouldn't be tight. It should be loose and free floating. There is a fix to that. You can buy an aftermarket spring-loaded firing pin, which again was on the earlier models. I don't know why they got away from that into the free-floating firing pin, but it's just an aftermarket part that you're able to put on here. Runs about $30 max. I think you can even get them as cheap as $20, but that completely eliminates that situation. There are certain SKSs that are more prone to it. Some people said they have multiple SKSs and been shooting them for years and years and never had that issue before. So, maybe it just comes down to the gun and again how dirty it is. You keep the gun clean, you keep it well maintained, you probably will never have that issue in your entire life. So, but other than that one issue, great gun. So what we're going to do is go ahead and break down the gun for you, show the disassembly of it. Alright guys, I'm going to try to show you this as best as possible with the type of conditions that I have, lighting, etc. What you're going to want to do is start over on the right hand side of the gun. There is going to be a dust cover release latch here. What you want to do is pull that into the upward position. What I do is kind of keep my finger over the back of the dust cover here, and the reason for that is because this is spring loaded. What you want to do once you have that rear latch in the upward position, the 90-degree position, this will actually come outwards, so just kind of pull it up and out of the gun itself, the rear receiver. And again, keeping my finger over the back of the dust cover here because it is spring loaded. That spring does come out there. Once you have that done, the whole dust cover will come right off. As I mentioned before, you will find that serial number right there punched into the back of the dust cover, one of those areas you want to look for. The dust cover should be a nice solid piece of metal here. You don't want to find any cracks or anything on this. Once you have the dust cover off, you can go ahead and return your dust cover remover thing there all the way back to the original position so it's out of the way for cleaning. And then you can go ahead and remove your spring. When you're doing reassembly, if we get to that point, I'll try to remind myself, but you always want to put the squiggly end of the spring back in first. I guess that's kind of how I remember it. The squiggly end back into the gun first. Once you have that spring out, you should be able to pull your bolt to the rearward position and pull it right off. The bolt and the bolt carrier here kind of go together like that. You can see that there's kind of a hook on that end and a hook on this end, and they kind of come together right there. So that's kind of easy way to remember how to get it back together. As I mentioned, you're also able to find the serial number on the bolt, and you're also able to find the serial number on the bolt carrier, or firing pin assembly, whatever you want to call it. And as I mentioned again, you should be able to shake this and hear that firing pin sliding back and forth. You don't want that firing pin locked into the forward position so you have protrusion out of the bolt face. If you can't get that to fall naturally back into the original position, that's when you got an issue for slam fire, and you want to make sure that you clean this out really well. You are able to find it on the inside of this extractor claw. I'll go ahead and pull that off for you here. We'll go ahead and disassemble this bolt right away, I guess. But to disassemble, you can go ahead and we'll probably drive this pin out first, actually. Take that pin, and we'll go ahead and grab something to drive that with. And what you're doing here is releasing the firing pin assembly. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and drive this pin out. And when you drive that pin out, this little piece comes out right here, which would have gone back into the firing pin assembly, such as that. Once you have that driven out, this firing pin will actually come all the way out. And again, as you can see, it's just one piece of metal. There's no spring there at all, so it's a free-floating firing pin. Once you have the firing pin out, then you are able to remove the extractor claw. As you can see, it's just a spring on the end of a piece of metal there, and it goes back in just as easy. When you're reassembling the firing pin, you want to make sure that when you're putting it in here, that you are rotating the firing pin. You can look right down through where you have that drive pin there. You want to make sure you have a nice clear hole. With this firing pin, it is actually got a recessed, you can kind of see it's recessed there down a little bit, so it's got a kind of an incline there. That's what stops that firing pin from going out the back of the firing pin assembly. So you got to make sure you have it turned, the firing pin, to the right area, and also all the way to the right position in order for that this drive pin here to remain intact. And really, once you have it in there, you don't really even need to drive this retaining pin back in. It actually should just kind of slide back in on its own, at least as far as it used to. Yep, there we go. So you kind of know you have it right, because again, you shouldn't use a hammer to get that back in. You should be able to just hand push that back in, and then you can see that drive pin is all the way back to the original position. And again, just checking to make sure your firing pin in there is free floating. So that's the bolt, which takes care of that issue. Once you got the bolt off, what you can do is flip the gun over. You know what, we're going to go ahead and skip that part for right now. We'll go ahead and remove the gas piston assembly since we're on the top of the gun. Much like an AK-47, you have a latch up here towards the rear spring sight, and mine is very difficult to get off. It's very tight. You can see there's actually scratch marks from where the claw here on this latch has kind of dragged across the metal, as well as probably an area where someone has used something like I'm using to drag it. It's very tight. I'm sure you can go ahead and bend that back. I haven't done that. It's already scratched quite a bit, so I'm not ultimately too worried about it. But I just kind of use a tool just to kind of give myself some leverage and try to get that pulled off there, because it is very difficult. It's very tight. What you want to do is pull it off to the 90-degree position there. Once you have it pulled to the 90-degree position, this the top handguard here should come right off with any luck. There we go. And with the top handguard, inside the top handguard is the actual piston that's driving it back and forth. And again, there is a electro-penciled number on the piston here. I don't know if that's going to be with every gun or not. Once you have the piston and handguard off, you want to be very careful with what position this is. Actually, I can see it's need to be at a 45-degree position, not a 90-degree position. As you can see there, that's ultimately where you want that to stop at, 45 degrees, I would say. Once you have that out, there is another spring-loaded system right inside here. It's kind of a guide system for the gas block. You want to kind of keep your finger in the front of your leaf spring here. Kind of right, if you were able to see this, it's kind of like a piston head almost. You can see it. But once you release this into the 90-degree position, it releases that piston out of there. So you kind of want to be very careful with that. And there's a piston and a spring. And that's part of your gas block assembly as well. And now you kind of have a clear hole all the way through your underside here, under your leaf spring, all the way through to the front of the gun. Once you have that stuff disassembled, we'll go ahead and put the spring back on this pin here. We'll flip it over to the other side and work on the bottom of the gun. Real quickly, before I forget, I guess I'll show you this cleaning kit is in the back of this stock here. Let's make sure I'm getting that. I am. A lot of people, what you're normally supposed to do is kind of use your finger to push in there. I would highly advise against that. It is, your finger can get pinched in there and it hurts like hell. I usually try to use some sort of, just anything like that to get get my hand in there instead of my finger. But once you pull it out, there's the cleaning kit. It's all self-contained there. There's actually some Cosmoline on this guy, so I'm not going to take it out for you. When you put it back in, kind of the same process. You don't want your finger in there because this thing can hurt like a bitch. So just kind of use something else. So with that said, we'll go to the bottom of the gun to get rid of this assembly here. And in order to disassemble this gun from the bottom side, you always want to make sure your safety's on first. The safety does need to be on to lock the trigger assembly into the position it needs to be in to be removed. From that point, what you want to do is go ahead and remove the trigger guard, or I'm sorry, the trigger assembly. And you are going to need some sort of screwdriver or a punch or something to that effect, at least for mine, because it is very tight. In the back of the trigger guard, there is a kind of a latch here of some sort. You can stick your thing in there, push on it, and that will release the whole trigger assembly. It should come right up and out. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward, but again, you want to be very sure that your safety is on. Once you have your trigger guard out, the magazine well comes out very easily. It's more of just kind of a clip in there type thing, just like that. Once you got your magazine well out, the rest of the gun is pretty easy to disassemble as far as getting the stock apart. You could go ahead and remove your rear swivel swing there if you needed to, I guess, but ultimately I don't do that. But going ahead and extending your bayonet, hoping you can see this, extending your bayonet out here so it's out of the gun, you should be able then to remove your cleaning rod, and then you should be able to remove your stock from the assembly here, the receiver. There's really nothing holding this together, so it's just a matter of wiggling it out. Can be difficult at times depending on how tight it's in there. Really it comes down to this front locking system here, right there mainly. That's kind of holding the rest of this gun in here. So if you kind of play around with it a little bit, trying to get my fingers in there, be able to something to push off of here. Nothing seems to be working that easily for me. There we go. So as you can see, the stock just came right off the receiver there. And then you're left with the receiver. So it is a carbine. As you can see, the barrel is pretty short. It's from my thumb here to my thumb here. And unfortunately, I don't have the exact measurements, but as you can see, it definitely meets that carbine criteria. To reassemble, pretty easy. Just the reverse order of what we just did. I'll go ahead and put my receiver back in my stock like that. You can go ahead and lock your bayonet down into the position that kind of holds everything together nicely. At that point then we'll go ahead and reinsert our magazine well. The magazine well is just going to go down into here. It should just pop right in. With any luck, there we go. And then we'll go ahead and put our trigger assembly back in here. And it just takes a little bit of finesse sometimes to get it back in. Now mainly you're supposed to be able to just push this right back down into the position. Mine is extremely difficult. There's actually a metal clip here that holds this in here that's attached to the stock, and mine is extremely tight. I tried bending it out to make it easier, but ultimately it's just not something that you're able to bend. It's more of a leaf spring, so that's kind of the purpose of it, that it doesn't bend. What I found that I needed to do is use kind of a rubber mallet, and I know I have one around here, I do. And I just kind of go ahead and pound this back into position. This table isn't too sturdy, so I'm hoping that this is going to work here. There, dead, good. And I just pound it right back into position, and that clip there returns to the outer of the trigger guard there, so it locks it in place. I'll go ahead and flip my gun around. At this point we'll go ahead and reinstall our gas block system here. We'll start with the spring and pin that came out of right underneath the rear leaf spring. I'll go ahead and slide that in. And I kind of use this something again to kind of push it in. You could use the piston even if you wanted. Something just to kind of push it into the assembly while we try to, and this is going to be difficult for you to see guys just because of the angle I need to do it at, But what I'm doing is kind of just pushing this in. Maybe I can do it without the tool here. I can. Pushing it in and then rotating this guy back to the, well, I guess 45-degree position would be the best position for it, just so it holds that pin back in there. So it's holding that whole system right back in there again. At that point then we can put our piston back in here, and if you kind of look at the gun, that's kind of how you figure out how it needs to go back together. But you got your rear handguard that's towards the back of the gun here, and then your piston guide system that's towards the front. And if you can think about that, you'd ultimately think that, yeah, okay, my piston needs to, I'll be pushing this way, so that's kind of how it needs to go back together. I start towards the front of the gun and align it in the front there, and then I just drop it back down into the rear here. May have to oop. And it ejected that pin. You have to be careful of that with that system here, is making sure that you don't lose that spring in here. Maybe I didn't have it in a good enough position for it to hold it, maybe even. There we go. I'm going to put this back in here. And sometimes that happens too. We get this guy who gets stuck in there. He doesn't want to cooperate. We'll slide that back down into here, like that. And now at this point we should be able to push our clip here on the leaf spring all the way down to that original position. I'm going to go ahead and use something to pull it again, because mine is very tight. I don't know where that tool is. There it is. Hopefully yours is not this tight, because I tell you, this is not the easiest way of doing things, and it certainly mars up this metal a lot more than I would like it to. But this is a working gun. It's not a fancy collector gun, so I'm not too ultimately worried about it. Once you got your gas block reassembled there, as you can see, everything looks like it's in place. We can go ahead and take a look at our bolt and our bolt carrier. So again, we have that bolt, firing pin, bolt carrier, whatever you want to call it, with our actual bolt here. We'll go ahead and put them together just like that. This is again more of a trickier step, just trying to get into the right position, but just go ahead and set it into the bottom of the gun here. And what we'll do is kind of try to wiggle it and get it to the forward position. Well, and one thing to note, I always make this mistake, but you do have to have the magazine well here released, because it is a catch on the last round open. So if you have the magazine closed, it's like having a magazine in a semi-automatic pistol. It'll lock back in that rear position. Likewise, when you're reassembling the gun, if this isn't open, your bolt isn't going to travel to the forward position. So that's one mistake I always make when I reassemble this gun. I'm always like, what am I doing wrong here? But it's actually just because that magazine well is open. Or closed, I should say. So once you have it open, you should be able to slide it to the forward position. At that point, you can go ahead and close your magazine well again. That doesn't need to remain open. You can take your spring, again, squiggly line in first. We'll just put that into the back of the bolt there. At that point then, you can do one of two things. You can leave the spring in that position, or you can move it up to this position to get the dust cover back on. I tend just to leave it in this position. Either one will work though. But what you want to do, again, because it's spring loaded, is kind of use your finger to push it in. And actually we'll need to pull our clip out here first. We'll pull it into the 90-degree position and pull it outward. We'll put our dust cover back on. There we go. And we should be able to slide it. And while we're holding it, we should be able to push that clip back in, down, and now we should be fully reassembled. Well, excluding the cleaning rod that I forgot to put back in, but that's easy enough to do. So at this point, you should be able to go ahead and test your action. And like I said, it locks open when you have the mag well open. Everything looks like it's working good. So as I mentioned, guys, really easy gun to disassemble and clean, and ultimately just a very reliable, nice rifle. I really enjoy it. I'm glad to have it part of my collection. It is more of an investment piece to me, but you know, I'll get a lot of use out of the 5-10 years that I have it in my collection until I eventually sell it. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, guys. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed. Hope this helps you out, and thanks for your time.